The clipboard came at her before anyone said good morning. Tess Marsh had been standing at the top of the boat ramp at Larkspur for 11 minutes with her rifle case at her feet and the tide coming up the concrete toward her boots. And the first human contact she got was a chief petty officer with a manifest and a pen, holding both out sideways without looking at her face. "Sign for the class," he said. "Then find whoever's running admin and tell them the fuel truck's late." "I'm not admin." "You're not." He looked at her then. 24 years old, and she had one of those faces that made people ask for a second form of identification. Freckles across the nose, hair braided flat and wet at the temples from the walk down. "Huh," he said, and took the clipboard back and went to find somebody with more chest on them. Down at the water, the causeway ran 300 meters out to Bell Island. 8 steel pontoon sections lashed nose to tail, and the ebb was starting to press against the upstream side of it with a low sucking noise like something drinking. A heron stood on the second section and did not move. Out past it, the delta went flat and brown and endless. Reeds and mudflats and old channels. Fog lying in the low places the way smoke lies in a room. Somebody had chalked the class roster on a board by the shed. 22 names. Hers was at the bottom, below a line, in different handwriting. Marsh, T. We, August Observer. She read it and didn't do anything with her face at all. An older man in a canvas jacket came down the ramp with 2 coffees, looked at the board, looked at her, and handed her one without being asked. "Hollis Grange," he said. "I keep the ranges, the boats, and the pipes. Been here 22 years, which means nobody listens to me either." He blew on his cup. "Tide's the only honest thing on this river. Everything else out here will lie to you eventually, including the map. Good to know. You're the augment." "I'm the augment." He watched the water climbing the ramp for a second. "Well," he said, "it's a long course. If you're new here, hit subscribe before we go any further and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I read everyone. Stay with me to the end of this one, because before it's over, you're going to watch this woman lying flat in 6 inches of running water inside a concrete pipe under a levee, waiting for her own gun smoke to blow clear so she can fire again. And you're going to watch her walk out alone onto a bridge that has already started coming apart in daylight, with every gun on that river looking right at her. The delta smelled like low tide and diesel, and something green rotting politely. That was the first hour of it. She had learned to shoot in a place with no water in it at all. 9 years back, a county range in flat farm country, August. The kind of heat that makes the mirage boil up off the 200-yard berm like the air is full of clear worms. Tess was 15 and shooting her grandfather's old rifle badly and constantly, and a man named Vern Cobb owned that firing line the way a bad landlord owns a building. He was 50-something, thick through the neck, and he had a voice that carried without effort to the far end of the line and past it. She beat him once at 19 in the first relay of a regional match. She held the lead for 2 strings. And then, in the 3rd string, he read a switch she didn't, and he took her apart by 9 points, and when the scores went up, he stood in front of 11 people with a paper cup in his hand and said, "The kid shot a nice group. On the wrong wind. That's not shooting. That's weather being polite to you." She had gone out to her truck and sat there with her hands flat on the wheel until she could breathe through her nose. He knocked on the window 40 minutes later. 4 a.m. Saturday, he said. "Bring the same rifle. Don't bring that face." He never apologized for the cup, or the 11 people, or any of it. What he did instead was give her 2 summers. 4 in the morning, cold coffee, wind flags he'd made out of surveyor's tape, and a running commentary that had no kindness in it anywhere and no waste in it either. The thing he said most, the thing he said so often she used to mouth it along with him behind his back, came out of an afternoon in a hay barn. He'd made her shoot out of the barn's dark interior through the open door at a plate 400 yards off in the stubble. She'd hit the door frame twice, splinters everywhere, ears ringing, Cobb standing behind her with his arms crossed. "You're looking at the plate," he said. "That's the target. The target's not your problem. Your problem is whatever's between you and it, and most of that is close enough to touch." He'd kicked the door frame with his boot. Whatever's close to your muzzle beats whatever's far from it, every time. You want to shoot through a hole? Quit looking at the far end like it owes you something. Find the middle of the hole, then quit arguing with it. She had gone back inside the barn and lain down again and put 4 in a row on the plate. He'd said, "Better," and gone to get a sandwich. She had never forgiven him for the paper cup. She had also never taken a shot in her adult life without hearing him. Both of those things were true at once, and she had stopped trying to make them agree. There was an envelope in the bottom of her footlocker that had been to 3 countries and never to a mailbox. It was addressed to Ed Prentice, Prentice Marine Repair, and the corners were soft as cloth from being handled and put back. Inside it was a cashier's check for $2,300 and a piece of notebook paper with 4 different beginnings on it, 3 crossed out. When she was 19 and shooting matches on weekends, she'd worked at Prentice's yard, sanding hulls and running the parts counter. Her truck's engine let go in February. No truck meant no drill weekends, no drill weekends meant no slot, and no slot meant the whole thing folded before it started. She'd been standing in the yard office trying to do arithmetic that didn't work when Ed came in with a rebuilt long block on a pallet jack and said, "This came in wrong for the Wilsons. Take it before I have to look at it." He'd paid the tow. He'd paid the machine shop. He had never once, in 6 years, in any of the Christmas cards, in the 2 times she'd stood in that office in uniform, mentioned a dollar of it. She'd had the money since she was 21. The problem was that she could not think of a sentence to put on the notebook paper that didn't sound like she was handing it back to him. "Thank you" sounded thin. "Here's what I owe you" sounded like an accusation, like she was calling it a loan when he'd never called it anything. So the envelope went to the bottom of the locker under the spare boot socks and traveled the world, and every few months she'd take it out and read her own crossed-out handwriting and put it back. She'd told exactly nobody about it. Not one person in 9 years. The timed movement was on the 3rd morning, at low water, across 2 miles of tidal flat between the camp levee and the beacon at Sandy Point. The rule was simple. From the levee gate to the beacon and back, no roads, no lines, and the fastest man sets the standard for everybody. 22 students, 11 of them SEALs off a platoon working up, plus cadre, plus 1 augmentee observer. They started on a whistle. The SEALs went straight because straight is short, and straight took them into the soft ground. Mud out there is not one thing. It has a grain. There are old oyster beds under it that hold shell, and shell holds a boot, and the rakes run in curves because the current that laid them ran in curves, and if you have spent 3 days walking a place at low water instead of sitting in a briefing tent, you know where the curves are. Tess went left, away from the beacon, which looked to everybody watching from the levee like a woman getting lost in the first 200 meters. She ran on shell. It banged under her boots like broken crockery, hard and loud and level, and it curved north and then east and then south in a long, lazy S, and she did not once sink past her ankle. Out in the middle of the flat, the field of men had strung into a line of struggling shapes, thigh deep, hauling each leg out of the ground with both hands, and the sound coming off them was the sound of a wet mouth opening over and over. She hit the beacon 4th. She left it 1st. She came back up the levee gate at 19 minutes 40, breathing hard through her nose, mud to the knee and clean above it. The second man in was a SEAL named Wyatt Rourke, who was genuinely, unarguably good, a big, loud, gorgeous athlete of a man who had never in his life needed to be modest and had accordingly never learned. And he came in at 22 minutes 50, and he went straight past her to put his hands on his knees. Chief Fisk wrote the times on the board. Rourke straightened up and looked at the board for a while. Then he laughed, and he made sure it carried because his voice was built for that. "She cut the course?" "She didn't cut the course," Hollis said from the shed door. "I watched her the whole way. She went around by the shell rakes. It's a mile longer." "Then she got lucky." "Twice then," Hollis said. "She walked it Tuesday." Rourke put his hands on his hips and said the thing that ended up traveling, the thing that got repeated in the chow line, the boat shed, and eventually into a report. "Man, relax. She's a trainee. She's an augment. She's an observer. She's a line on a manifest. She's here to fill a seat so somebody in an office can say the seat was full. He said it grinning to the men in the open air at a volume designed for the levee. Just a trainee. Don't make her a story. Tess pulled her right boot off, tipped a half pint of gray water out of it, put it back on, and laced it. That night, the mess tent ran out of everything except rice, canned peaches, and a 5-gallon jug of hot sauce that had been in the Delta longer than most of the cadre. Doyle sat down across from her with his tray. Emmett Doyle was 36, Marine Recon, gray coming in at the temples on the course because his command had run out of ways to say no to him. He was the only other person there whose paperwork said something odd, and he had noticed her the way one outsider notices another, which is to say immediately and without comment. Peaches, he said. There's a system, Tess said. You put the hot sauce in the peaches. There is no system. There's a system. I've been eating in tents since I was 18. She did it. She ate it. She kept a completely level face while 3 men down the table stopped chewing to watch. Doyle stared at her. Was that good? It was terrible. I did it because you were all watching. And she laughed. Actually laughed, head back, and it broke something in the tent, and the whole table went off, and Chief Fisk came over to find out what was funny and ended up telling a story about a fuel barge and a wedding cake that ran 9 minutes and had 2 endings. For about half an hour that night, she was just a person in a tent who was easy to sit near, and 11 men found that out by accident, and none of them ever quite unfound it. The long-range shoot was 2 days later, across the cut with a hard east crosswind, and it was designed by somebody who wanted people to fail. 840 meters, steel plate the size of a chair back, hung on the derelict crane barge's boom on the Bell Island side. The wind came across the water in shoves, not gusts. The Delta gives you 15 seconds of one thing and then 11 seconds of another. And the fog had lifted only part way, so the mirage lay in bands. They shot in pairs, shooter and spotter, 3 rounds each. Cold. Doyle and Tess drew each other. He went first. He read at 8, called it right, and put his first round 2 feet downwind of the plate. His second one rang it. His third one went into the water. 2, she said. That's the best score up there. It's a garbage score. It's the best garbage score. She got behind her rifle. She lay there for 40 seconds doing nothing at all, which on a firing line feels like an hour, and Doyle watched her not touch the elevation turret and not touch the windage turret and not look at the flags. What are you doing? Feeling it here. It's not doing here what it's doing there. No, she said. But here is where the bullet starts, and it's slowest at the end. Whatever's close to your muzzle beats whatever's far from it. Her hand came off the rifle and lay flat on the mud beside it, palm up, fingers open, like she was checking for rain. There, that's the shove. She came back to the rifle. Hold the far edge. First round rang the plate, second round rang the plate, third round rang the plate. 3 tones across 840 meters of moving air, a beat and a half apart, and the sound came back off the island a half-second late each time like an echo of an argument nobody was winning. Doyle said quietly into his glass, 3. The line behind them had gone strange. Not silent. Men were talking, but the talking had changed shape. Rourke was at the far end with his own spotter. He had shot 2 of 3, which was, again, genuinely good. He stood up and looked down the line at her for a long moment with the wind pulling at his collar, and he had a mouth on him, and everybody was waiting for it. He put his tongue in his cheek and turned around and started packing his gear. That was the first time she cost him something. Hollis Grange could not have told you what it was he saw, and he tried 3 times later to 3 different people and gave up. It was the following afternoon at the Causeway abutment, blowing 30, the ebb running 4 knots, and the whole 8-section string of pontoons working against its cables with a rhythmic iron groan. Section 3 had taken green water across the deck. Marty Teague, the boatswain's mate who ran the causeway and the boats and most of the waterfront, was trying to get a heaving line out to the mid-channel pile cluster and getting it back in his face twice. Tess came down the ramp with a coil over her shoulder because he'd asked, and she walked out on the deck. That was the thing. That was all it was. She walked out on a wet steel deck and 4-knot current at a jog, and she never once put a foot where the water had been. She went along the crown, the dry line, in a curve the way she'd run the flats, and she didn't look down doing it. At the 4th section, she took 2 turns and a hitch on the lug, through, hit the dolphin first cast, and tied off behind her back while she was already looking at something else. "Well," Hollis said out loud, to nobody. Marty was hauling. "She tied that off?" "Yeah. That's a good knot." "It's not the knot," Hollis said, and then stood there with his mouth slightly open because it wasn't the knot and it wasn't the throw, and he had watched competent people on that water for 22 years, and he could not for the life of him say what he'd just been shown. She came back up the ramp and stopped at his shed, where the flood culvert ran under the levee. A 6-foot concrete barrel, 60 feet long, with a flap gate on the channel end and a screen on the pond end, and Hollis half in the mouth of it with a rake, hauling out reed trash. "You do that every month?" "Every month for 22 years. Pond behind the levee drains through her on the ebb. Flap swings open when the pond's higher, slams shut when the river is. She breathes in and out twice a day like a lung." "Where does it point?" He looked at her. "It don't point anywhere. It's a pipe. Everything points somewhere." Hollis laughed and stuck the rake in the mud. "Straight down the channel, at the old shrimp house at Norrie Landing, if you want to know, because the ditch behind the levee follows a property line some surveyor drew in 1952, and they never argued with it. You can lie in there at low water and see the packing house dock like it's on a television." He wiped his hands. "Nothing to see. Been closed since before you were born." On the wall of his shed, on a nail, a come-along hoist, a coil of wire strop, and 3 drift pins in a coffee can. In her hip pocket, where they had been for 6 years, a flat tin of wax earplugs, because she had learned early what a bad day does to a person's hearing. The observation event started at 0400 on the 7th day, and it was supposed to run 24 hours. The task was to go out into the flats alone, dig in, and watch Norrie Landing across the water, the packing house, the dock, the road behind it, and log every vehicle, every boat, every person. It is the least glamorous thing anybody at that camp did all month. It is also, if you ask the people who do it, the whole job. They pulled the first man out at 18 hours with cramps. 2 more came in at 22 when the flood tide started climbing into the hides and the mosquitoes came off the reeds in sheets. Rourke came out at 26 hours, upright, filthy, furious, having logged everything correctly, and having also decided that a man who could not feel his own legs was no longer useful to anybody. At 29 hours, there was 1 hide still occupied. Tess Marsh lay in a scrape she had cut into an old shell rake with the floodwater at her chest and her rifle up on a rolled poncho, and she had by then filled 14 pages, the tin roof of the packing house, its loft door on the north gable, the collapsed lean-to, the 4 pilings, the barge grounded on the mud south of it, the exact place the road came down out of the reeds, the range to the dock gate, 610 meters, and the fact that on a falling tide the current in the cut ran a hair east of straight because of a sandbar that only existed in her notes. She had also written down the wind at 11 separate times of day and what her own hands had felt when she wrote it. At 6:40 in the morning, the tide topped out and started back, and the fog sat down on the water like a hand. At 7 o'clock, she began her crawl in, cold, hollowed out, her thighs shaking in long, slow waves, and she was 200 meters from the levee gate when she heard outboards. 4 boats. She lay flat in 8 inches of water and turned her head, and out of the fog on the cut came the shapes, low and fast, and there were men standing in them, and the first burst of gunfire off the water arrived a half-second after the muzzle flash and sounded like somebody dropping a sheet of plywood on concrete, over and over. Behind her, on Bell Island, 41 people were standing in the open on a live-fire range with blank magazines and no idea yet that anything had happened. Here is what 41 meant. 22 students, 9 cadre, 6 partner nation trainees, 3 range staff, and 1 corpsman on an island 300 meters from the camp, connected to it by a floating steel bridge that ran across the deepest, fastest water in the delta. There were no mortars at a training annex. There was no gunship. The alert helicopter sat 2 hours away with a delta fog bank between it and the coast, and the quick reaction force could be on the road in 20 minutes and at the gate in 90. 90 minutes is a very long time. Tess came through the levee gate at 7:11 with her rifle across her forearms, plastered in gray mud to the eyebrows, and the first thing she saw inside the wire was Marty Teague running for the causeway winches, and the second thing was a rocket-propelled grenade going into the number 5 pontoon from 400 meters and lifting one corner of the bridge out of the water like a card. The sound of that reached her a beat later, a deep, flat whump with a metallic scream in it. The bridge began, from that second, to come apart. Commander Neil Ashby ran the annex out of a plywood building with a window unit in the wall, and he had been on the radio for 11 minutes when Tess Marsh came in through his door, dripping delta water on his floor. "Get to the bunker with the," he started. "Sir, there are 2 guns in the packing house loft at Norrie." He stopped. "North gable, loft door, 1 belt-fed and 1 man with glass," she said. "They opened at 7:06. They're ranging the causeway deck and the levee crest. Everything on the water is theirs until somebody takes that loft." "How do you know it's the loft?" "Because I've been looking at that building for 29 hours. Ashby was 51 and had spent his career being careful, and he looked at this filthy young woman in his doorway and had an experience he did not enjoy. "Marsh," he said, "I wrote Observer on your line." "Sir, let me finish, because I want to be the one who says it." He put both hands flat on the map table. "The slot came in, and I looked at your photo and your age, and I wrote AUGOBSVR with my own pen, and I did it in about 4 seconds, and I have been doing that for 4 seconds at a time for 29 years. He straightened up. "There are 41 people on that island. Take whatever you need." 2 minutes later, the net heard a voice it did not recognize. "Larkspur, Marsh. I'm at the levee sump. From my position, packing house north gable, 1 belt fed, 1 shooter with optics, 610 meters. Second element landing south end of Bell, 4 boats, 8 to 10 men. They're moving north up the island road. Recommend everybody on that island goes to the north quarry face and stays there. It's rock, and it's the only thing on that island that stops a bullet." Somebody keyed and said, "Who is that?" Ashby keyed over him. "That's the augment," he said. "Do what she says." The next 3 hours were the longest of everyone's lives, and they went in pieces. The first piece was 10 people crossing while the fog still held. They came off Bell Island at a dead sprint, 3 and 4 at a time, and the bridge banged under them, and the packing house guns fired at sound and shapes and hit nothing but water and steel. When the 10th man came off the last section and fell down on the ramp, Chief Fisk shouted the count up to the plywood building, and it went out over the net. 31 still on the island. The second piece was the fog burning off at 7:50, and everything getting worse at once. Tess had gone up the inside slope of the levee to the sump, a low concrete box where the pond drain met the culvert, because it was the only place on the camp bank with any view at all of the water, and because everything else was either behind the levee, where you were blind, or on top of it, where you were dead. At 7:52, a man from range staff named Ramsey went up on the crest with binoculars to look at the island, and the packing house shooter put a round into him at 600 meters, and 2 men who went up after him got one back down and got hit doing it. That was the shape of the whole morning. Anything above the levee line was a target. Anything below it was blind. The third piece was the bridge. "She's hinged," Marty Teague said, half into the radio and half into Ashby's face. "5's gone. 4's holding 6, 7, and 8 all by itself on one lug and a pin and the ebbs building. When she runs at max, call it 10 o'clock. The current takes that whole downstream limb and folds it back on itself like a hand closing. And when she folds, sir, she comes off her anchors, and then she's just 300 meters of steel going down the cut sideways. Can you hold it? I can pin it. 2 men, 12 minutes, out on 4. Under those guns." "Yes, sir." The fourth piece was 2 men going out on 4 with a come-along and a strop and a drift pin, in daylight, in front of everybody. Doyle went because he was standing there and because he was made a certain way. They low-crawled the first 3 sections behind the deck combing, which is 11 inches of steel, and 11 inches of steel is enough if you love it, and the packing house belt-fed found them at the join of 2 and 3 and walked a burst across the deck plates with a sound like a hammer on a filing cabinet, 6 times, fast. They lay in the wash for 90 seconds. The bridge worked under them. The current came up through the gap where 5 had been and threw brown water over both of them at intervals. Then they went again. They got the strop on. They got the come-along hooked. Marty was on his knees at the lug with the drift pin in his fist when the whole downstream limb of the bridge took a shove from the ebb and Section 4 rotated 8 degrees on its remaining coupling, and the gap at the lug closed like a jaw, and Marty Teague's right leg went into it to the knee. He did not scream. He said, "Oh," in a surprised voice, and then he said, Doyle, it's got me." Doyle got a strap under his arms. Doyle stood up to take the load, in the open, at 600 meters, and the marksman in the packing house loft shot him through the calf and dropped him on the deck like a coat off a hook. From the sump, Tess saw both men go down. Doyle, Marsh, say status. Nothing. Water was coming through the culvert flap behind her in a slow, gulping rhythm. Out on the cut, a boat engine ran up and throttled back. Somebody on Bell Island was shouting a name over and over. "Doyle, Marsh, say status." Nothing. She counted it out because counting was the only thing left to do with her hands. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. At 40, she stopped counting and started again from 1 because the number had gotten large enough to mean something and she did not want it to mean that. Her mouth had gone completely dry. There is a specific memory that arrives at moments like that, and hers was a hay barn door and splinters in her cheek and a man's voice saying better, which was no use to anyone, and she could not make it stop. 51 seconds. Marsh Doyle. His voice came back wrong, thin and low, a man talking with his cheek on steel. "I'm on the deck. Teague's pinned at the fore lug. My leg's no good. Radio went in the water. I'm on his." She put her forehead down on the concrete for exactly 1 breath. "Understood. Stay down. Do not stand up again." "Copy." She got up on the sump wall with her glass and read the packing house for 11 seconds, which was too long, and a round came off the concrete 2 feet to her left and filled the air with grit, and she got down. Belt fed in the loft door. North gable. Firing left of the doorpost. Scoped rifle lower and right out of the 2nd-story window at the south end, in shadow behind a hanging piece of tin that moved. And down on the mud by the grounded barge, 2 more with rifles and boats. Everything on that river that mattered lived in one building, 610 meters away, and there was not one place in Camp Larkspur from which any human being could see it and live, except one. She turned around and looked at the mouth of the flood culvert, and the mouth of the flood culvert was underwater. Marty Teague was talking about his brother because the alternative was thinking about the water. Tess had gone out at 8:50 along the combing 3 sections of low crawl with the deck banging under her chest, and she had gotten to him with a med kit and a coil and no way on God's earth to move that steel. The lug had him across the calf, angled, with the whole downstream limb of the bridge loading it. Every few minutes the ebb shoved and the pontoon rolled a degree, and he made a small sound. She got a strap around his chest and made it fast to the combing so that if the section went, he would not go under it. She cut his trouser leg and packed and wrapped a long gash on his forearm he hadn't noticed, and taped it and taped the tape, working with her face 8 inches from her hands, quick and neat and small, and she did not look up at the packing house even once because looking would not change anything and it would use up something she needed. "You're the mud runner," Marty said. "I'm the augment. That's what they keep saying." He laughed, and it went thin at the end. "Bait shop," he said. "What?" "Me and my brother Cal had a bait shop. 9 years ago we had a fight about $4,000, and neither one of us has said a word since." He held up his key ring with 2 fingers, and there was a brass key on it, worn shiny. "I still got the key to it. It's still half mine on the paper. 9 years I've carried that around and looked at it." His breathing went short. "That's stupid, right? That's a stupid thing to be thinking about." "No." "Marsh." He had gone gray. "Am I going to die out here?" She stopped taping and looked right at him. "No." Here's why. The water's falling, not rising, so nothing about your situation gets worse in the direction you're afraid of. The pin they need is 9 inches long, and I know exactly where it is. And at 10:20, that pipe under the levee comes out of the water, and when it does, I can see the men shooting at you, and they can't see me." She snapped the tape off. "You'll be off this bridge today, and you'll get to be stupid about that key for another 40 years. He shut his eyes. "Okay. Give me the key ring." "What?" "Give it to me. If it goes in the river, that's a whole extra thing you have to do." She put it in her chest pocket and buttoned it. "Now stay flat." Rourke's platoon was pinned at the North Quarry face on Bell Island, behind 40 feet of blasted rock, with 31 people crouched in the shade of it, and men coming up the island road at them, and no way off. He had watched the causeway through his glass. He had watched 2 men go out. He had watched them both go down. He had watched a third person crawl out to them, and he had known who it was from the way she moved on the crown of the deck, and he had put the glass down for a second and put the heels of his hands in his eyes. Then he keyed his radio, and he did not say anything for a while. Later they timed it off the recording, because the range control tapes ran the whole morning. 9 seconds of open carrier with his breathing on it, and the flat crack of rifle fire in the background. 9 seconds is a long time to broadcast yourself thinking. "Larkspur, this is Rourke." Another second. "I need Marsh." Chief Fisk at the plywood building would say afterward that the whole room turned around. "Say again, Bell." "I need Marsh," he said. "I need Marsh on those loft guns. We've got 31 on this rock, and they're coming up the road on us in about 15 minutes, and nobody moves on that bridge while that packing house is alive, and she's the only person on this river who's looked at that building." His voice cracked on the last part, and he let it. "That's my recommendation, sir. I'd like it on the tape that it's mine." There was a pause on the net. Then a woman's voice, flat and clipped and entirely uninterested in the moment. "Bell, Marsh, copy 31. I'm going into the pipe at 10:15. Keep everybody off the deck until you hear from me." The mouth of the flood culvert came out of the river at 10:14, and she was already lying in it. She had gone in from the pond end at 10:05, past the screen, into the dark, on her belly, pushing the rifle ahead of her, and it was 60 feet of 6-foot concrete barrel with the whole borrow pond draining through it, 6 inches deep and moving fast, cold enough to take her breath, black as a closed hand. There is a way that sound behaves in a pipe. The water hissed and boomed at the same time. Her own breathing came back at her off the walls, doubled and wrong. She got to a spot 40 feet in where the invert ran clean and set the bipod down in the flow. And here is what she did. The first thing is the water. In a round pipe, the water finds the invert, which is the true bottom of the circle, and it runs there because it cannot run anywhere else. And the deepest thread of the flow is the exact center line of that barrel. She put her hand flat in the current and moved it left and felt it shallow, and moved it right and felt it shallow, and found the thread. She set her left bipod foot and her right bipod foot the same distance either side of it. Now the rifle was on the pipe's own center, not on hers. The second thing is the far end. She got behind the scope and looked down 60 feet of blackness at the mouth. And the mouth was not a circle. It was a crescent, a bright fingernail of river light with the whole top of it cut away by the concrete she was under. "Larkspur, Marsh, I'm in. I'm not aligned yet." "Say again." "When I'm off the axis of this pipe, the far end looks like a crescent. When I'm on it, it opens up into a full ring. Nothing else in here will tell me. I can't see the walls, and I can't see my own barrel." She shifted her elbows and the crescent fattened. "Whatever's close to your muzzle beats whatever's far from it. If I try to shoot at that building before this end is a ring, I put my round into 60 feet of concrete 2 feet in front of my face." Ashby, in the plywood building, with his hands on the table. "Understood." She moved. She dropped her chest a half inch, and the crescent grew a horn. She came up and left, and it closed. She went right and down, and the bright shape swelled, and then, all at once, it closed itself into a perfect bright ring of river and sky, with the whole world sitting in the middle of it. 610 meters away, in the center of that ring, small and gray and absolutely still, was the north gable of the packing house. Larkspur. I'm aligned. Bell reports contact on the island road. Copy. She took the tin out of her hip pocket and rolled 2 plugs and pushed them in, and everything went soft and huge. One more thing, when I fire in here, it's going to fill with smoke, and this pipe only breathes one way, out, on the ebb. Somebody tell Bell it'll be about 20 seconds between shots, and that's not me being careful. Marsh, Larkspur, tide's running. You're clear to engage. She put the crosshair on the loft door. Then she waited. That is the part nobody tells you about. The whole thing had been noise since 7 in the morning, and now it was a woman lying in cold running water in the dark with her heart going, watching a small gray rectangle 600 meters away, waiting for the wind she could feel on her own wet face to do the one thing she needed it to do, which was nothing. Wind out of the east, quartering, 7 in shoves. 11 seconds of shove, 15 of lull. She had learned the rhythm of that river over 29 hours in a hole. She held the far edge of the doorpost. The shove came and went. The lull started. She let out half a breath and broke the shot, and the pipe went off around her like the inside of a bell. She felt it in her ribs and her sinuses and the roots of her teeth. Concrete dust came down. The mouth of the culvert vanished in a wall of white smoke, and she could not see anything at all, and she lay there in the dark with water running past her elbows, counting 1 and 2 and 3, and there was no way in the world to know whether she had hit or missed or shot a hole in the 60 feet of concrete over her head. At 19, the draft took the smoke out of the mouth in one long, tearing curl, and the ring came back. The loft door was empty. The belt fed had stopped. Larkspur Marsh, 1 down, working on the second. The second man was harder because he was in shadow behind a hanging sheet of tin at the south window, and she could not see him, only the tin, which moved when the wind shoved. She watched it for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She watched it move with the wind, and move with the wind, and then move against the wind, once, 6 inches, when a man's shoulder came out of the shadow behind it to lay a rifle on the sill. She was already there. The pipe went off. The smoke came. She counted 19. The ring came back, and the sheet of tin was hanging perfectly still, and there was nothing behind it. Larkspur, Marsh, she could not hear her own voice. 2 down, the loft's out. Then 2 more on the mud by the grounded barge, at 490 meters, 23 seconds apart, because they had made the very human decision to look at the building where all the noise had stopped. At 10:42, the packing house had nothing alive in it. She was out of the pipe by 10:50, and she went straight down the ramp to the bridge with Hollis Grange's come-along in her right hand and 2 drift pins in her pocket. Fisk got in front of her. There are still men on that island road. Yes. They can see the deck. Yes. Marsh. Chief. That section rolls another 6 degrees, and it takes his leg off, and then it takes the bridge, and there are 31 people who still can't cross. She went around him. She walked out. She did not crawl. There was no point in crawling. She needed to be up on her feet, and her hands needed to be free, and so Tess Marsh walked 300 feet out onto a folding steel bridge in full daylight, in the open, in front of Bell Island and the far bank and every window at Norrie Landing, with a hoist over her shoulder. 31 people watched her do it from behind 40 feet of rock, and Rourke watched her do it through a spotting scope, and Ashby watched from the levee gate, and Hollis watched from the shed door with his hand over his mouth, and not one of them could do one single thing to help her. It took 11 minutes. The strop was still on from where Marty had put it. She hooked the come-along into the strop and into the deck ring on Section 4, and she began to ratchet, and a come-along is not a fast machine. It is a lever and a pawl and a click, 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 click. The whole downstream limb of the bridge, 3 sections and 40 tons of it, had the ebb tied on it like a hand on a door, and she was pulling against the ebb 1 inch at a time with a hoist meant for engines. "Talk to me," Marty said. He was the color of the sky. "Marsh, talk. Ratcheting. That's not talking. You've got a bait shop," she said. Click. "Tell me the name of it." "Teague Brothers." Click. "Original. It's a good name," he said. "It's got both of us in it." Click. The lug came open a 1/4 inch and closed, and came open a 1/2 inch. Somewhere out on the water, an outboard started up and ran away downstream to the south, and she made herself not turn her head. Click. At 11:01, the gap was 2 inches wide. "Pull," she said. "I can't feel it." "Don't feel it. Pull." He got both hands under his own thigh and hauled, and his leg came out of the jaw of the coupling, and she caught his shoulders and put him flat, and got the drift pin out of her pocket, and drove it home into the lug with the heel of the hoist, 3 strikes, ringing out across the water, and set the second pin behind it. Section 4 stopped moving. She keyed the radio. "Larkspur Marsh, 4 is pinned. The bridge will hold. Cross them." They came off Bell Island in waves, and the count came down the net in Fisk's voice, and it was the best sound anybody heard that year. 19 on the island, 7 on the island, 0, 0 on the island, all 41 accounted for. She reported it the way you'd report a busted pump. Larkspur, Marsh. 4 loft engagements complete from the culvert position, 610 meters, 4 confirmed. Bridge section 4 is pinned with 2 drift pins. It'll hold on this tide, but somebody has to re-shackle it before the flood. Teague has a crush injury right lower leg and a laceration to the right forearm. He's conscious, he's on the ramp. Doyle has a through and through to the left calf, ambulatory with help. That's everything I've got. There was a pause on the net. Larkspur copies all, Ashby said, and his voice did something on the last word, and he took his thumb off the switch. She sat down on the concrete of the ramp with her back against the shed and put the radio in her lap. That was when her hands started. It came up through her forearms and into her fingers, and she watched them do it with a kind of clinical interest, the way you'd watch weather. She could not have gotten a magazine into a rifle. She put them under her armpits and sat there. The corpsman, Falk, went past her at a run with a bag. 2 men carried Doyle up the ramp between them, and Doyle looked over at her and said, "Hey," and could not get the second word out, and just kept his hand up until they carried him past. Hollis Grange came down with a blanket and did not say anything at all. He put it around her shoulders and sat down beside her on the concrete with his knees up, an old man in a canvas jacket, and he stayed there for 11 minutes without one word, and then he said, "That's my come-along you left out there. I'll get it." "You will not," he said, and went and got it himself. Lieutenant Commander Grant Lindley arrived on the 4th day from the Joint Task Force with a laptop, a folder, and a very reasonable manner. "I want to be clear that this is not disciplinary," he said. He had set up in the classroom, at the end of a folding table, with the window unit rattling behind him. "There are 4 dead men at Norrie Landing, and a damaged causeway and a dead range employee, and my job is to write down what happened in an order that makes sense." "Yes, sir." He turned his folder around. "This is the course roster. Your line says Marsh, TR, August Observer, non-qualified, observer status." He tapped it twice. "Then I have a range control tape in which a commander tells the entire net to do what you say. Help me." "That's the roster, sir. It's correct." "Correct." He sat back. "The report from Bell Island states that 4 hostile shooters were engaged from a drainage culvert at 610 meters in a single 10-minute period by a person lying inside the pipe." "Yes, sir." "Ms. Marsh, I have shot competitively for 11 years. You cannot aim a rifle in the dark inside a 60-foot tube." "You can't aim the rifle, sir," she said. "You aim the pipe. There's a difference, and it's the whole thing." "Explain it to me." So she explained it to him. The invert and the thread of the draining water and setting the bipod feet either side of it, the crescent and the ring, the 20-second breath of the pipe on the ebb, and why she couldn't shoot faster than that no matter who was screaming on the radio. The 1952 property line that put the barrel on the packing house dock. The tide table on the shed wall and the time the mouth came clear. Lindley wrote for a while and then stopped writing. "Who told you the culvert pointed at that building?" "Mr. Grange did, on day 4. He was cleaning it out." Lindley looked at the door. "Mr. Grange is outside. He has been outside since 8 o'clock. He said he was going to be. He has brought me a laminated tide table with the 10th marked, a maintenance log going back 9 years, and a photograph of the interior of that pipe taken at 0400 yesterday by a petty officer Rourke, who apparently waited up it with a tape measure and a phone in the dark and would not tell him why." He set his pen down. "There is also this." He slid across her data book. 14 pages, 29 hours. Every vehicle at Nori Landing, every boat, the loft door, the tin sheet at the south window, the 4 pilings, the range to the dock gate, and the wind at 11 separate hours with a note beside each about what her own hand had felt. Lindley read 3 pages of it in silence. You logged this before anything happened. That was the exercise, sir. Everyone else came out. Yes, sir. He closed the book gently, the way you close something in a museum, and looked at the window unit for a while. I'm going to need a new first paragraph, he said. Doyle found her at 2 in the morning on the boat ramp with his leg up on a paint bucket and a bag of frozen peas from the mess going soft on his shin. The tide was down. The whole delta was ticking and popping the way it does at low water, 10,000 small things in the mud. Can't sleep? I sleep, she said. It's not going well. He got himself down onto the concrete beside her, which took a while and involved language. They sat. I have to tell somebody a thing, she said. Okay. When I left Teague pinned on that bridge to go into the pipe, she was looking out at the black water. I was relieved. Doyle didn't say anything. He was lying there asking me if he was going to die, and I was already gone. In my head, I was already at the sump looking at the tideboard, because the pipe was a problem I knew how to solve and he wasn't. Her voice stayed completely level. I have thought about that every hour since. I left a man in a jaw of steel, and part of me was glad, because the next thing was easier. How long did it take you to hook that hoist? That's not the point. It's exactly the point, so answer it. 11 minutes. In the open. Yes, Marsh. He shifted his leg and hissed. You want me to tell you you didn't feel it? I'm not going to, because you did, and I've felt it, and every man on this river who's any good has felt it. You know what the feeling is? It's your hands looking for the next thing they can actually do. That's all it is. It isn't gladness. It just wears gladness because you were raised to think a calm person is a cold one. That's convenient. It's not convenient. It's 4 in the morning and my leg hurts. He turned his head. You want the true thing? Here it is. Marty Teague is asleep in a bed 80 feet from us with both legs because a person who was relieved to leave him came back out and stood up on that deck where I could not stand up. You don't get to have the feeling and not the 11 minutes. You get both. That's the whole deal. The water made its noises. I've never told anybody anything like that, she said. I know, Doyle said. That's how I know you're not cold. Hollis Grange kept a coffee pot in his shed that had been through 4 commanders. On the 6th morning, he poured 2 cups and put a fold of paper on the workbench between them. You've been carrying that around all week, he said, sitting on the winch drum with it in your hand every night. I'm nosy, not blind. Tess turned the envelope over. The corners had gone soft as cloth years ago. There's a man named Ed Prentice, she said. He owns a boatyard. When I was 19, my truck engine let go, and if I'd lost the truck, I'd have lost everything I've got now, all of it. And he put a rebuilt engine in it, and paid the tow and the machine shop, and lied to my face about where it came from. She set the envelope down. $2,300. I've had the money since I was 21. I've written the letter 4 times. What's the trouble with the letter? Every version sounds like I'm handing it back to him. Hollis nodded slowly and drank his coffee and looked out the shed door at the water. I've been on this river 22 years, he said. I've floated a mechanic's rent twice and a cook's funeral once, and I bought a young fella a set of tires in '99 that he still doesn't know I bought. He set the cup down. You want to know what happens when they try to pay me? What? It hurts my feelings, he shrugged. Now, I'm not saying that's right. It's just what happens. Because the day they hand me an envelope, I stop being a man who did something and start being a bill that got settled, and every year of it in between turns into nothing. That's the part they never think about. So I shouldn't send it. I didn't say that. He turned around and leaned on the bench. Marsh, you've had that money 3 years. That ain't about the money. You know exactly what that is. She didn't answer. It's permission, Hollis said. You're waiting for him to say you don't owe him. So you can quit being the girl in his office who couldn't do arithmetic. And he's never going to say it, because in his head there was never anything to say, and so you have been standing at that door knocking for 6 years, and there's nobody behind it. The window unit 2 buildings over cycled on. He's 71, she said. Yeah, Hollis said. That's the other part. She sat with it for a long time. Outside, somebody dropped a length of chain on the ramp and swore at it. I'm not going to send the check, she said at last. No? No, I'm going to fly into Baltimore on my leave, drive out to the yard, and stand in that office and tell him what happened to the money he gave me. All of it, every year of it. And then I'm going to ask him what he needs done, and whatever he says, I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to leave until it's done. Hollis smiled at his coffee. There you go. I've had this envelope in a footlocker for 6 years. Uh-huh. And the answer was to go stand in a room and talk to an old man. Most of 'em are, Hollis said. That's the annoying part about answers. Rourke came across the yard at dusk on the 8th day while she was cleaning the rifle on the tailgate of a truck, and he stopped about 10 feet short, which was, for him, a completely new distance. She kept working the bore. I measured that pipe, he said. I heard. I wanted the numbers to be wrong. He put his hands on his head and took them off again. I got in there at 4 in the morning with the tape, and I got about 30 feet up, and I had to stop because the sound in there with the water. I sat in the dark in that thing for a couple minutes just to see if I could, and I could not do what you did in there. Not with anybody's rifle. He looked at the ground. Then I went and got a light and did the rest of it and gave the tape to that investigator. You didn't have to. He had your line of the roster in his hand and my quote in his folder. Rourke swallowed. The quote's mine. I said it in the open where everybody could hear it because I wanted it to travel. And it traveled, and it got as far as a lieutenant commander with a laptop, and he read it out to me off a page. The bore brush went in and came out. Marsh, I've been... He stopped and started again. I've been the best guy in every room since I was 19 years old, and I don't know how to... He stopped again. That's not an apology, that's me explaining myself, which is a different thing, and it's worse. She set the brush down. I said you were a seat, he said. I said it grinning. I said it to 11 guys who'd have followed you into a wall by Thursday if I'd kept my mouth shut. And I said it because you ran that flat faster than me, and I wanted somebody to think the flat didn't count. He made himself look at her. I'm sorry, I'm not asking you to say it's fine. Tess wiped her hands on the rag and looked at him for about 4 seconds. Then don't, she said. He nodded and stood there a second longer and went. And that was the whole thing. The call came through the camp landline on a Tuesday, patched from a switchboard, and Fisk had to come and get her out of the chow line. Is this Marsh? Tess Marsh? Yes, sir. My name's Cal Teague. A big, slow voice with a lot of ocean in it. I'm the brother. Yes, sir, I know how he is. I've been on the phone with him twice today, which is twice more than the last 9 years. A long breath came down the line. Ma'am, I've got to say something, and I don't have any way to say it right, so I'm just going to say it wrong. Okay? He called me from a hospital bed, and he said, Cal, it's Marty. And I said, I know who it is. The voice broke apart and put itself back together. 9 years, over $4,000, and some things we both said about our father. 9 years I've been driving past that shop with the plywood on it, and he called me, and I got to say, I know who it is, and I would not have got to do that. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I would have got a phone call from somebody with a rank in front of their name, and that would have been the rest of my life. Tess stood in a plywood hallway holding a heavy plastic receiver. I don't know a thing about what you do, Cal said. I don't know a single word of it, and I don't want to. All I know is my brother's on the phone. He was crying, unashamedly, the way men that age cry when they've decided to. That's it. That's all I called to say. My brother's on the phone. She got out. Yes, sir. And then her face came apart. She sat down on the floor of the hallway with the receiver against her chest and cried out loud, ugly and loud, both hands over her mouth and not helping at all. And she said into her own palms, I couldn't get him out. I couldn't get him out for 11 minutes. To nobody, to the linoleum, to a man on a telephone in a different hemisphere who could not hear a word of it. Cal Teague waited. He had been in a family a long time, and he knew what waiting was for. When she could talk, she said, He kept his key. He what? He's got the key to your shop on his ring. He's carried it for 9 years. She wiped her face with her wrist. I had it in my pocket for a while. It's a good key." There was a very long silence on the line. "Well," Cal Teague said. "Hell." They read the course results in the classroom on the last Friday, which was the only room at Larkspur big enough, with the window unit off so people could hear. 40-odd people in there, the cadre along the wall, Rourke's platoon in the middle rows, the 6 partner nation trainees down front, Ashby at the back with his cover under his arm, and Hollis Grange standing in the doorway because he did not sit in classrooms. Lindley had stayed an extra day and nobody had asked him why. Chief Fisk had the clipboard, and he was not a dramatic man, and he read it exactly the way he read a fuel manifest. Timed movement, unimproved terrain. Fastest time, 19 minutes 40. Marsh. Nobody moved. It had been 3 weeks. Everybody in the room already knew the number. It was the second one that started it. Long-range serial, 840 meters, cold bore, 3 rounds, high score, 3 of 3. Marsh. That's the only clean score fired on this course in 4 iterations. Somebody in the third row said something under his breath, 1 syllable. Observation event. Fisk turned the page. Standard is 24 hours. Man-hours logged, Rourke, 26. Marsh, 29 plus. Marsh is the only student in this iteration to complete the full event. He lowered the clipboard slightly. She was still in her hide when the first boat came up the cut. That's how we knew there were 4 of them and where they landed. The room was doing something, and it had not made a sound yet. The first face to change was a young partner nation trainee down front, who did not have all the English and had been watching Fisk's mouth very hard, and who got it about a beat late, and whose whole face opened. Then a lieutenant in the second row put his hand over his eyes. Then Wyatt Rourke stood up. He did it badly. He caught the back of the chair in front of him with his knee, and it barked across the floor, and he did not care. And he stood up in the middle of his own platoon in a room where he had spent 3 weeks being the loudest and best thing in it, and he brought his hands together over his head, once, twice, and the sound of one man clapping in a silent room is an awful, exposed, naked sound. And he did it anyway, alone, for 4 full seconds, with his jaw set and his eyes wet, and every one of his own guys watching him do it. It cost him more than the 11 minutes on the bridge had cost her, and he knew it, and he paid it standing up. Then his swim buddy stood, then the whole row went, chairs going back, and then the cadre along the wall came off it, and then the partner nation trainees, who stood the way people stand for anthems, and then Lindley, the investigator, who had come here to reconcile a roster. Ashby was the last to stand, at the back, and he stood the longest, and he did not clap. He just stood with his cover under his arm, looking at the floor about 6 feet in front of him, and what was on his face was not admiration. It was an older man doing arithmetic on 4 seconds and a pen and 29 years, and finding that the number was very large. It went on and on. Somebody was whistling. Somebody was pounding the wall with the flat of his hand. Hollis Grange in the doorway took his hat off and held it against his chest and looked at the ceiling tiles so nobody could see his face, which fooled no one. And Tess Marsh sat in the middle of it in a folding chair with her boots flat on the floor and her hands loose in her lap, and she did not stand, and she did not smile, and she did not look around. She looked at the front of the room, level, the way she had looked at a bright ring at the end of 60 feet of dark, and once, for about a second, she closed her eyes. Fisk let it run for a minute and a half. Then he put the clipboard down on the table because he had run out of anything useful to say, and he did not pick it up again. Hollis Grange found her by the culvert 2 mornings later, sitting on the sump wall with her boots in the mud, watching the flapgate breathe. He'd been trying to say it since the day she tied the knot on the causeway, and he'd told his wife on the phone and gotten it wrong, and told Fisk and gotten it wrong. "I figured out what it was," he said. "That day on the bridge, what I saw." "What did you see?" "You never looked at the deck." He lowered himself down beside her with a grunt. "Everybody looks at the deck. 22 years I've watched some good, hard men go out on that thing, and every last one of them walks out looking at where his feet are going to go. You looked at where the water had been. You went along the dry crown of it in a curve like it was a sidewalk." He put his hands on his knees. "And when you tied off, you didn't look at the knot. You were already looking at the next thing. That's it? That's it. That's the whole thing. He nodded out at the brown water. You wasn't reading the bridge, girl. You was reading the river. Everybody else out here reads the equipment and hopes the river agrees, he spat. Ain't nobody ever taught that. You either look at what's actually in front of you or you look at what somebody told you would be there. He got up and dusted off the back of his pants. 22 years, Hollis said. I've been out here since before you could walk, and I've never once seen anybody do it. That's the plainest I can put it. 14 months later, there was a marina on a lake in eastern Tennessee with the dogwoods out, and a woman came down the dock in civilian clothes and stopped before she sat down and looked at the piling. She looked at the wet line on it. She looked at the dark ring of algae above the water and the 2 inches of pale wood showing beneath it, and she stood there for 4 or 5 seconds working out how long it had been falling and what it meant on a lake where it meant nothing at all, where a dam somewhere ran the whole business on a schedule. Then she sat down. Doyle came down the dock behind her with 2 coffees and a limp that would be with him for good. He was out now, running a small outfit that taught mariners and offshore crews how to not die in the water, and he had 11 employees and a bad opinion of paperwork. You do that every time, he said, handing her a cup. Do what? Nothing, he said, and sat down, because he had decided a year ago that he was never going to mention it. Marty Teague came out of the shop at the top of the ramp with his rolling gait and a bucket in each hand. He was 50 pounds of hardware down from a leg that had needed 3 operations, and he still worked 11 hours a day. The sign over the door said, Teague Brothers Bait and Tackle in green, and it was new paint over old, and inside it Cal was arguing with a man about a trolling motor, which is what Cal did now instead of not speaking to anyone. Marsh! Marty hollered. You want to see something? He put a bucket down and dug in his pocket and held up the key ring. The brass key was still on it, worn shiny, hanging next to the new one. Kept it, he said, delighted with himself. Cal says it's stupid to have 2 keys to the same door. It's a little stupid, she said. It's extremely stupid, said Cal from the doorway. Rourke called that evening while she was on the porch of the rental with her boots off. He was cadre now at the sniper school, teaching, which had surprised absolutely everybody who knew him and nobody who had been in that classroom. They put your pipe in the program, he said. I'm not kidding. There's a culvert on the North Range, and I've got a block of instruction called Confined Aperture Engagement, and I stole every word of it off your statement to Lindley. You're welcome. I tell them the crescent and the ring. I tell them about laying the bipod either side of the waterline. A pause. I tell them who figured it out. Every class. First slide. You don't have to do that. I know I don't. Another pause, and she heard him decide something. Marsh, I've got 22 of them lined up in a classroom every 6 weeks, and about 4 of them are the guy I was. So I do have to do it, actually. I just don't have to admit it. She laughed, and out on the lake something jumped, and Doyle called up from the dock that the coffee was getting cold. Later, when the light went orange, Doyle asked her the only real question he'd ever asked her. Do you ever think about what would have happened if that pipe pointed somewhere else? It didn't point anywhere else. That's not an answer. Tess turned her cup around in her hands. A man drew a property line in 1952 and nobody argued with it, and an old man cleaned that pipe out every month for 22 years so it would still be a pipe, and I asked him where it pointed because I was bored. She shrugged. Everybody wants to know the far end. The whole thing was 3 feet from my face and 60 years old and full of water. That's usually where it is. Down at the shop, somebody rolled the door closed for the night. There is a boat ramp at Larkspur, and it is still there. 2 years on, there was a lamination taped inside the door of Hollis Grange's shed, a single page in careful block capitals, and every course that came through that place got walked past it on their first morning the way you'd walk somebody past a photograph in a hallway. Position 9, flood culvert, enter from pond end, lay the bipod either side of the running water, the water finds the center for you. Watch the far mouth. A crescent means you are off the axis. A ring means you are on it. Do not fire until it is a ring. 20 seconds between shots on the ebe. That is the pipe breathing, not you being slow. On the range map, out across the flats, somebody had drawn a curved dashed line from the levee gate to the beacon at Sandy Point and written hardline beside it in pencil, and every class since had run it, and nobody under a certain vintage could have told you where the name came from. The tide board on the pivot pier had a small notch cut in it at 1.40 meters, which was where the water had been at 10:14 on a Tuesday morning, and Hollis had cut it himself with a hacksaw blade and never told anybody why. And he retired the following spring to a fish camp 11 miles downstream, where he is a great deal of trouble to his neighbors. She came back through once in transit, on a gray afternoon with a bag over her shoulder, and she walked down to the water because there was an hour to kill. The causeway lay out across the cut, 8 sections, new pontoons in the middle too, banging quietly against the ebb. A heron stood on the second section and did not move. Tess Marsh walked to the edge of the concrete and looked at the wet line on the ramp, and read how long it had been falling and how much of the day was left in it. Then she turned around and went up to catch her ride, level-eyed, unhurried, one hand loose on the strap.